How did we get from this
I didn't mean to at first. Really, I didn't.
to this?
It shot in LA and it paid so much. And it was like there was this little lifeline thrown to me.
This is what Oscar-winning acting looked like in 1934.
Take my advice. Grab the next bus back to Miami. That guy's a phony.
I didn't ask for your advice.
Compare that to what most acting feels like today.
Is everything okay?
Yeah. Why?
You seem, I don't know, like something is...
Everything's fine.
Okay.
I don't think these performances from It Happened One Night are bad by any means. They have a charming quality, are funny, at times emotionally vibrant, and they certainly fit the bill for what was expected from a performance in Hollywood at that time, but they also feel almost nothing like we expect a good performance to feel like by today's standards. How did we get from here
All right, you've had your little joke. Now tell us about it.
No, Sam, no!
to here?
I'm standing around like an idiot, waiting for you.
Waiting for what?
Waiting for you.
Waiting for what?
Waiting for you to get rid of me.
For much of the early part of film's history, depth and emotional authenticity weren't really a big expectation. Realism wasn't the order of the day, but instead, clearly enunciating dialogue in the early sound pictures,
Gentlemen, there's the gun that killed Goles.
and later playing the type that would reinforce your role within the Hollywood star system. Film writer Isaac Butler describes it this way. Good acting in the 1930s entailed believably applying your type to your films, whether it was the dashing, devil-may-care romance of Errol Flynn or the hard-boiled cynicism of Humphrey Bogart.
You boys find a gun on Owen Taylor when they fished him out of the drink last night?
So, for example, Bogart, who was an excellent actor in his own right when playing a role in The Big Sleep
I don't like people who play games.
or in The Maltese Falcon,
And this will put you in solid with your boss.
would not have been that concerned with disappearing into the role or creating a realistic performance that evoked layers of hidden emotion. Instead, his primary goal would have been to simply fulfill the role or type that he was known for while communicating the necessary emotion for each moment in the story. This kind of actor and acting still exists to some extent. I think Tom Cruise is a good example. While he's capable of realistic character acting, what Tom Cruise is primarily known for is not transforming himself into a character, but for being Tom Cruise, for playing the type of guy he usually plays in movies, and for the technical craft of doing his own stunts. But this is kind of a dying breed. The Academy Awards don't really honor this type of acting that much anymore, and Tom Cruise is often referred to these days as the last movie star. Instead, what is usually considered great acting today is when an actor feels like they disappear into a role. We feel good acting is an actor who can play a range of characters. When the performance feels so real that we forget momentarily that we're watching an actor and not the character.
It makes something special for you. How do you like to feel?
When we don't just know what emotion the character is feeling because we can see it on their face, but actually feel like the character or maybe even the actor really felt that emotion during the performance. So what happened? Why does acting feel so different now? This video is sponsored by Mubi. Sign up to enjoy an exceptional library of hand-curated cinema at mubi.com/ThomasFlight. Over 10 months ago, I dove into really trying to find the answer to this question. But to really understand the evolution of film acting over the last century, beyond the most surface-level explanations, proved to be more complicated than I thought it would be. In telling this story, I hope to untangle some of the complicated mess that is this subject matter, to help you better understand how acting works, and to help you understand how acting transformed from old Hollywood theatricality into the multifaceted, naturalistic form we see today. And I want to try to thread the almost impossible needle of telling that story accurately without oversimplifying things, but also without getting too lost in the weeds of the infighting of esoteric acting teachers.
Surrender to the soup, Barry.
I don't know what that
Let's
means.
pick a soup. Let's pick a soup.
To begin our story, let's go to the performance that is usually considered pivotal in the evolution of American film acting. By the end of this video, we'll have to clear up several misconceptions about this performance, but it still makes for a pretty good starting point. In the 1951 film, A Streetcar Named Desire, we can literally see the transformation from a classic theatrical style of Hollywood acting to the more naturalistic style we expect now taking place. Vivien Leigh, who won an Oscar for her performance as Blanche Dubois, is recognizable as the representative of the old Hollywood theatricality.
Don't you love these long, rainy afternoons in New Orleans?
And Marlon Brando as Stanley Kowalski represents what is now recognizable as a more contemporary style of acting.
You know, there's some men, Blanche, that I took in by this Hollywood glamour stuff, and there's some men that just aren't.
Brando's performance here, and his Oscar-winning performance a few years later in On the Waterfront, would go on to widely be considered very influential performances, and in a sense they certainly were. These performances looked unlike most of the other acting that was taking place at the time in Hollywood.
All right, okay, then just let me enlighten you on a point or two.
But these performances are also the center of a lot of confusion and misunderstanding because of the new technique that Brando was allegedly using behind the scenes. To really continue this story, we're going to have to address the elephant in the room. We need to talk about the boogeyman of the film acting world. We're going to have to talk about this is Robert De Niro's actual New York City taxi cab driver's license, which he got while he was preparing for the role of Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver.
How's your driving record? It's clean. It's real clean, like my conscience.
The acting teacher that De Niro trained under taught that if the actor can make the situations in which the characters find themselves vivid and believable, then emotion should flow naturally. De Niro believed that if he really understood the details of the life of the character Travis Bickle, including what it was actually like to drive a cab in New York City, then the emotion necessary for the performance would flow naturally out of this. Developing this understanding for De Niro included working actual shifts as a cab driver, picking up and dropping off riders, as well as listening to recordings of the criminal Arthur Bemer and losing 35 pounds. This kind of preparation for a role was not new for Robert De Niro. Prior to this, for a role in Bang on the Drum, he started chewing tobacco and learned how to play baseball, and he would push this approach even further on later projects. For Raging Bull, De Niro spent a year hanging out with and recording the real Jake LaMotta, who he was playing in the film. He learned how to box, gained 60 pounds in the middle of filming, and stayed in character on set, requiring the cast and crew to address him by the character's name. These tactics of trying to literally live within a role that Robert De Niro pushed to new extremes on these films are what we commonly refer to now as method acting.
When Andy steps in, you know?
I step in.
You're not Andy, you know? You're playing Andy in this.
I know, you talk like I'm not even standing here.
And this approach has grown in infamy since then. Other almost exclusively male actors have followed in Robert De Niro's footsteps with varying degrees of commitment. Daniel Day-Lewis is perhaps the most famous and acclaimed actor to use this approach, and Jared Leto is probably the most ridiculed. Daniel Day-Lewis has repeatedly gone to extreme lengths for roles. He reportedly spent a month living in the woods of North Carolina preparing for his role in The Last of the Mohicans. He made everyone on the set of Lincoln call him Mr. President. He caught pneumonia on the set of Gangs of New York because he refused to wear a coat. And he spent 2 years learning dressmaking for his latest and final film, Phantom Thread. Jared Leto, on the other hand, was allegedly doing things like sending live rats to his castmates on the set of Suicide Squad to get in character for the Joker. Shia LaBeouf on the set of Fury had a tooth pulled for the character, refused to shower for 8 months, and had self-inflicted wounds on his face. Many such stories abound about Jim Carrey, Leonardo DiCaprio, Forrest Whitaker, Christian Bale, and others. The press and the internet together have created a mythos surrounding this style of method acting by often valorizing the extremes actors are willing to go to for some roles. But just as often, method acting has faced criticism and even ridicule. For example, Jeremy Strong's intense commitment to the role of Kendall Roy on Succession, which involved at times isolating himself from his fellow performers and showing up for work tipsy, was openly criticized by his fellow cast member Brian Cox, who even said he was worried about Strong's well-being.
I worry about what it does to him.
A Wikipedia article for the psychological effects of method acting lists fear, anxiety, sleep deprivation, and psychotic disorders as potential harms. And beyond the harm these actors might pose to themselves, many cast and crew members have talked about how difficult method actors can be to work with. And the behavior that some of these actors using this approach engage in under the guise of getting into character can tip into the territory of cruel or even outright abusive.
So I always say about people who do method acting, you only ever see people doing the method when they're playing an asshole.
I think much of the criticism of working this way is completely valid. While an intense level of commitment and immersion in a role at times has produced some great results that I love watching on screen, just as many times actors might go to these intense lengths and the performance is remembered more for the crazy behind the scenes antics than actually for the quality of the performance itself. And while many actors who engage in this kind of acting feel that this approach is crucial to finding truth and authenticity in a performance, the number of incredible performances that we see out there that don't involve going method just goes to show that it's possible to do great acting without this insane, intense, immersive approach. I'm not bringing all this up to criticize this style of acting. I think that's been done fairly thoroughly already. The reason I mention all of this is because we can't tell the story of American film acting without understanding what method acting is and where it came from. But that's complicated because
you're not a method actor, right? You would say no to that. Yeah.
No. Because I'm not really a method actor.
When Daniel Day-Lewis was asked about method acting, he said, "I don't follow it." Nobody can get their story straight about what method acting even is. Isaac Butler, in his book on the history of the method, describes how Lee Strasberg himself, the acting teacher most closely associated with the method, criticized what most people these days would call method acting. Remaining in character at all times greatly distressed Strasberg. Speaking of Pacino, he said that it's not right that he carries an identity with him long after a role is over. It isn't healthy. And Lee Strasberg was publicly criticized by Robert De Niro. So what is going on here? The more I dug into this, the more questions arose. Are these guys in just some kind of strange denial? What is method acting? Does it even exist? Why can nobody agree on what it is? Richard Brestoff, in his book Great Acting Teachers and Their Methods, says this about the method's place in the history of acting. The formula in most people's minds is this: Lee Strasberg plus the method plus the actor's studio equals Marlon Brando acting genius. But that equation is hopelessly misleading. Here,
I'll get it,
is the real moment an actor first trained in the method walked onto a film screen.
Is this? It is. Come in, Mickey. I've been waiting for you. Been struggling with this opus for days.
It's John Garfield in the role of Mickey Borden in the 1939 film Four Daughters. Garfield's performance, which earned him a Best Supporting Actor nomination at that year's Oscars, doesn't seem particularly impressive by today's standards.
Say, this is no joke. These are good links.
But if you compare it directly to the other performances in the film,
Modern tone poems, I call them,
the differences become more evident.
Here!
Where the other actors in the film hit their marks and deliver their lines with the kind of Hollywood theatricality we saw in It Happened One Night, there's a relaxed presence to Garfield's performance and a quiet searching in his face that seems to betray layers of buried emotion. It feels less like he's playing the character and more like he is the character. It's a clear shift from what acting teacher Uta Hagen calls representational acting towards presentational acting. By Hagen's definition in her book Respect for Acting, the representational actor deliberately chooses to imitate or illustrate the character's behavior. The presentational actor attempts to reveal human behavior through a use of himself, through an understanding of himself, and consequently an understanding of the character he is portraying. Instead of acting with the goal of indicating or portraying a specific emotion or achieving a specific result, the presentational actor, or an actor trying for realism, trusts an emotionally realistic performance will emerge from their identification with the character and what the character is experiencing in the story. Whatever technique he was applying, John Garfield's approach was perfect for this role in Four Daughters. where the character is one that doesn't quite fit into the neat types that society and that at that time the pictures cast for its members. However, it's not Garfield who is usually credited with giving the first method performance, but instead Brando. It's not that difficult to see why. While you have to be paying attention to catch what Garfield is doing, Brando's performance loudly and boldly announces itself as something different. Ultimately, though, regardless of how they were labeled, Garfield, who was taught by Lee Strasberg, and Brando, who had another acting teacher, would have been using different approaches to acting. And what Garfield was doing behind the scenes here,
Get married. You better go home. People are waiting.
would have had no resemblance to the approach ultimately taken by Robert De Niro, Daniel Day-Lewis, or many of the actors that we label method actors today. So what was John Garfield doing? Lee Strasberg, who called his teachings the method, taught relaxation exercises, concentration, and sense memory exercises. For example, an actor might be asked to pick up an object like a mug and study it for several minutes. Then the object would be taken away and the actor would be asked to recall the specific sensory details of the object, like its weight, texture, and color. These exercises had the goal of improving the actor's imaginative capacity. But the real core of Strasberg's method, and its most controversial element, involves something called affective memory. Affective memory is sometimes oversimplified as using past emotions for a performance. You know, like if you're trying to cry for a scene, think of something sad from your life.
Attach it to something that's real for me.
Exactly. Right, have some memory, some sense of if it were really your mom or a dear friend.
But the actual technique is more complicated. Instead of going into the past and trying to remember the emotion itself, Strasberg taught his students to take an emotional event from their past and recall and recreate the sensory details of that experience. So for example, if an actor wanted to tap into the emotion they felt when they found out a close friend died, they wouldn't try to remember the emotion itself. Instead, they'd remember where they were, the weather, the feeling of the chair they were in, and the color of the walls and what they were wearing when they heard the news. Some actors find that when recalling the details of a scene like this in as much detail as possible, it produces the emotion of that moment. And you can then repeat this exercise with an event from your life over and over, conditioning yourself to quickly drop into that memory and feel that emotion. Then you could use the exercise for a bunch of different memories and essentially build up a collection of easily accessible emotions that could then be used in performances. For Strasberg, the well-trained actor possesses conditioned emotional responses that can be turned on and off at will. He placed emphasis on control and taught an approach that found the emotional material for a scene in the past experiences of an actor, who would then channel and apply them to whatever the story needed. Strasberg's method of affective memory certainly worked for some actors, but there were many who were also critical of its effectiveness, and there was a lot of concern about the harm that might be caused by actors repeatedly delving into their past and recalling emotional events, some of which may be traumatic or deeply personal. You can also imagine how this approach might feel limiting for some actors. I've heard stories of acting teachers asking a student to delve into a traumatic experience in their past, but the student not being able to do it because they didn't have a traumatic experience to delve into. While Strasberg himself and his method were controversial and criticized in their own right at the time, he never taught actors to immerse themselves in an attempt to actually make the fiction of the character real. Isaac Butler recounts Strasberg saying, "You've heard actors say, 'Hit me, hit me. If you don't hit me, I won't get it.' Well, that's not acting. Sure, if I hit you, you're gonna fall down. What's the acting in that? The whole point is that I seem to hit you, and yet the way in which I hit you is so believable that you fall down and you are hurt and I haven't even touched you." For the sake of clarity for the rest of this video, if I'm referring to the specific thing done by De Niro and Daniel Day-Lewis, I'm gonna call it going method to distinguish it from the earlier forms of the method like the ones taught by Strasberg. But how did method acting come to mean not just the techniques laid out by Strasberg, but instead this immersive approach popularized by De Niro? Well, this is where we get to a second major complication in our story. One of Strasberg's students, one who disagreed with him about the usefulness of effective memory, would go on to found her own school of acting. This woman, named Stella Adler, is the woman who taught both Marlon Brando and eventually Robert De Niro. But while Strasberg and Adler's teaching differed significantly, neither of them really were teaching something entirely original to themselves. They both taught their own interpretation of a set of teachings called the system.
My system, my delicate system!
I'm gonna call you back.
Let's take a look at a scene from The Social Network and analyze the way an actor might approach the scene. The Social Network tells the story of the creation of Facebook. In this scene, Mark Zuckerberg, played by Jesse Eisenberg, has moved the budding startup from the East Coast to California. His business partner, Eduardo, played by Andrew Garfield, wasn't able to move to California right away and is showing up a few weeks late.
Eduardo? Hey, man. Waited an hour for you at the airport.
If we look at the script for this scene, which is written by Aaron Sorkin, it doesn't give the actors any direction for what emotion the characters should be expressing. There's just dialogue.
What time is it? It's midnight or 3 a.m. in New York, where I just came from.
So let's imagine we're Andrew Garfield. We're trying to understand what the character of Eduardo would be feeling in this scene. The first thing we might want to look at are the given circumstances. What is the character experiencing within the context of the scene and the script? Where is he? Who is he? What is he trying to accomplish? This can be everything from the fact that it's midnight and raining when he shows up, to the fact that Eduardo and Mark have known each other as friends for a long time, to the fact that Sean, Eduardo's business rival, is unexpectedly at the house. We also need to consider what Eduardo's tasks for the scene are and how they relate to the story. A task is what the character is trying to accomplish. We might consider that he's trying to help run Facebook as a profitable business. He's trying to keep things legitimate and above board and protect the company from controversy. This larger task has a subtask within this scene of convince Mark that Sean should not be involved with the company. But we also want to consider the more personal, emotional tasks of the character, like his friendship with Mark. Perhaps in this scene, Eduardo has the task of getting Mark to apologize for standing him up at the airport. There's more analysis we could do here, but once we've considered all the given circumstances, then we ask ourselves, if those circumstances were true, and if I was Eduardo, what would I do? Suddenly, if we look at the script now and we understand Eduardo's motivation and what he's trying to accomplish, the emotion springs naturally out of the text. So when Eduardo says,
"Wait an hour for you at the airport,"
we understand not just what Eduardo is saying, but why he's saying it, which reveals the subtext of frustration and maybe even a feeling of betrayal. Later when he says,
"You gotta move out here, Eduardo. This is where it's all happened. You hear what I just said?
The connections, the energy."
We understand that this isn't just a literal question. The emotional subtext of this line might be something like, "Why are you ignoring everything I keep saying?" Most importantly for this scene, we start to understand the subtext of this line from Mark.
"I'm afraid if you don't come out here, you're gonna get left behind."
This sentiment from Mark threatens all of Eduardo's tasks at the same time. It speaks to his weakening friendship with Mark, the feeling of betrayal, his concerns about being able to keep the business afloat. So theoretically, if Garfield, as he's playing this scene, really puts himself in the shoes of someone who shows up soaking wet, finds his rival unexpectedly at the house, is hoping for an apology or an acknowledgement from Mark, and finds his friend not just unapologetic, but ignoring everything he's saying, then the frustration and anger appropriate for the performance will come naturally out of that.
We're in 160 schools, including 5 in Europe.
I'm aware of that, Mark! I'm the CFO!
At least that's my probably inadequate attempt to apply just a few of the script analysis techniques taught by Russian theater practitioner Konstantin Stanislavsky. In the early 1900s, Stanislavsky developed an approach to acting he called the system, the way of approaching a role that I just used with its given circumstances, actions, and tasks are just one small part of Stanislavsky's system. There is much more to the system than this, including some of the ideas we've already covered, which were adopted by Strasberg, like relaxation exercises and effective memory. But it would be impossible for me to detail what exactly the system is in this video. It was an extensive collection of theories and exercises which were constantly evolving throughout Stanislavski's life. It involved charts that looked like this. And this book here, An Actor Prepares, which Strasberg based most of his teaching off of, is just the first of 5 volumes from Stanislavski explaining the system, and it contains passages like this one. Our aim is not only to create the life of a human spirit, but also to express it in a beautiful artistic form. An actor is under the obligation to live his part inwardly, and then give to his experience an external embodiment. I ask you to note especially that the dependence of the body on the soul is particularly important in our school of art. Here's what Stella Adler, one of the people most responsible for teaching Stanislavski's ideas in America, had to say about his writing. Don't read his book, because it makes absolutely no sense. He came from a culture entirely alien to yours, and you won't understand it. Well, I think that's an exaggeration. Ultimately, Stanislavski himself didn't think the written word was the ideal way to teach the ideas he was trying to teach, preferring instead in-person classes and coaching. And yet, within this complicated, evolving mess that was the system, there was a set of ideas that have revolutionized not just how some actors approach acting, but how the culture itself talks about acting, and even film and literature more broadly. Something which I think puts into context the influence that Stanislavski's work has had, not just on acting, but on culture as a whole, is the fact that the very term subtext, as it's used to mean the underlying hidden meaning beneath the surface of a text, originated with Stanislavski. David Bordwell, in his book The Way Hollywood Tells It, talks about how Stanislavski's ideas influenced screenwriting manuals, and therefore the way even stories themselves were written in Hollywood. For Stanislavski, the whole goal of this system was to convey truth and realism through a performance. Actors, in his view, should not just represent to the audience what the characters were experiencing, but themselves experience the role as they acted. It's not that there's no value to the old style of representational acting, what we would often call theatrical. Stanislavski said, representational acting can make a considerable impression, one which grips you while you are watching and leaves you with beautiful memories. But for Stanislavski, this style of acting lacked the depth that was possible in the realism of presentational acting. Representational acting can manage to provide whatever is designed to startle, surprise, or give you the theatrically beautiful or picture postcard feelings. But when it comes to the expression of deep passions, it is either too showy or too superficial. To really give this new style of representational performance, though, one that conveyed truth, would be a difficult feat. You might find yourself asking, how do you find truth within a fictional performance? Stanislavski says, when everything on stage is a lie, a fake, the set, cardboard, colors, makeup, costumes, props, wooden goblets, swords, etc., what kind of truth is that? His answer is that the truth of a performance is not in the external reality, but in the experience of the actor. He says, I don't need the truth out there, I need the truth in here. This internal truth is found by allowing the imaginary world of the play, the given circumstances, to become real to the actor psychologically. If everything around me on stage were true, this is what I would do. This is how I would respond to this or that event. The system used both an interior approach, like script analysis, relaxation, concentration, and affective memory exercises that we saw Strasberg taught, and combined them with an external approach, which involved physical movement, costumes, props, and embodying a character, to achieve the goal of realism, or creating a presentational performance. Doing this, according to Stanislavski, was the true art of acting. Part of this intensity was grounded in the fact that realism for Stanislavski allowed the theater in Soviet Russia to communicate a truth that was deeper than what was subject to censorship. The text of a play can be censored by the government, but the subtext of a play arguably can't be. What was communicated through the subtext of a performance, this truth that Stanislavski was after, allowed the theater to transcend mere entertainment and become a piece of spiritual and political art. What Lee Strasberg taught in his classes and based the method on was his interpretation of Stanislavski's system. And when Strasberg's pupil, Stella Adler, broke off from his class and went on to form her own acting class where she would teach Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro, she was teaching her interpretation and translation of Stanislavski's teachings. Adler placed more emphasis on the external approach, and other influential acting teachers of the 20th century, including Stanford Meisner, Robert Lewis, and Udo Hagen, also based their teachings on Stanislavski. Each American teacher emphasized or interpreted the system differently, but there was a core language and approach to acting within the system that can be found throughout all of them. Stanislavski's ideas have now become so ubiquitous that they are basically part of the language people use to talk about acting, whether or not they've studied Stanislavski or identify as method actors. So when Margot Robbie studies and then channels the movements of a honey badger for her role in Babylon, she's doing animal work, an exercise that can be traced back to one of Stanislavski's students and which was taught by both Strasberg and Adler. When Daniel Kaluuya in this interview talks about the power of repressed emotion.
Crying is heartbreaking, but seeing someone trying not to cry is even worse. Do you know what I mean? So it's that kind of like, I'm not even happy that I'm crying. I hate this emotion.
He's echoing something that Lee Strasberg taught. Strasberg's approach to emotion was to find it, express it, then suppress it. Find the emotion, and then find the way to allow it out, then hold it back the way the character would. When Billy Bob Thornton talks about the value of learning what the legal jargon meant for his role in Goliath.
If you don't know what it means and you're just listing stuff off, audiences are not stupid. Once I knew what it meant, then you feel like a lawyer.
He's expressing Stanislavski's idea that if the actor enters the circumstances of the play with commitment and belief, the actions will stimulate the proper feelings. When Stephen Yun says,
the task is always as difficult as it can be to not abandon your character. To like really live in their reality.
He's reflecting, again, Stanislavski. And when Don Cheadle talks about his high school drama teacher teaching him to ask the questions that professional actors ask themselves about a scene, like,
what's going on here? What's the text? What's the subtext?
He's asking the same questions Stanislavski taught his students to ask. When Robert Downey Jr. says here,
always know what your action is, because then when you come in the morning confident, or when you come in the morning and you can't hit your ass with both hands, you know what to do.
He learned that from Warren Beatty, who learned it from Stella Adler, who got it from Stanislavski. Nobody I just mentioned identifies as a method actor or has even been accused of going method or engaging in the kind of process that De Niro or Daniel Day-Lewis use. When Brian Cox, who is a classically trained Shakespearean actor, criticized Jeremy Strong's method acting, he's playing out a rivalry between method acting and the more British classical acting that's as old as method itself. If you've heard people talk about method in the past, you've almost certainly heard the story of Dustin Hoffman on the set of Marathon Man, staying up for 3 days to match the character's sleep deprivation for a scene. In response to this, his classically trained castmate, Laurence Olivier, famously said, "My dear boy, why don't you just try acting?" Classically trained actors receive extensive voice and movement training and have a foundation in performing the classics on a theater stage. But these days, most of them also receive training in Stanislavski's teachings as a part of their study. So how did method, what was originally just an interpretation of aspects of Stanislavski's system, come to refer instead to the approach popularized by De Niro? Because Strasberg based his teachings on Stanislavski's and called them the method, there's a tendency to conflate acting that is based on or influenced by Stanislavski with the method. Strasberg himself played into this. He tried to take credit for teaching Marlon Brando, even though Brando studied under Stella Adler. Brando, in his autobiography, said, "Lee Strasberg tried to take credit for teaching me how to act. He never taught me anything. To me, he was a tasteless, untalented person." Regardless of the accuracy, however, the conflation of the two stuck. Once Marlon Brando was marked as a method actor, the public's understanding of what method was became disconnected from what Strasberg taught and shifted to meaning either anything grounded in Stanislavski's teachings or just anything associated with the type of guy that Brando was on screen. Stella Adler, for her part, also conflated the method with Stanislavski, saying, Mr. Stanislavsky had his method, and the method is something you'll find through me. But also, she said, I am one of 2 million people who have been inspired by it. She saw herself as passing Stanislavsky's method on to her students, but she also had no special love for the term method acting itself. She claims once when an actor came to her and started saying he was a method actor, she interrupted him and said, "Get out of here. I don't want that around. It's too corrupt." So in the 50s, when Brando was performing, he got stuck with the label method acting, even though nobody could really agree on what exactly method acting was. Both Adler and Strasberg were claiming to teach Stanislavsky's method, but they taught different things and disagreed on what the method was. To this day, a lot of the disagreement stands. As I write this, the Wikipedia article for method acting says it's based on Stanislavsky's teachings and was formulated by Strasberg, Adler, and Meisner together. While a different part of Wikipedia, the article List of Acting Techniques, says that other acting techniques are also based on Stanislavsky's ideas, such as those of Stella Adler and Stanford Meisner, but these are not considered method acting. Here's the way Isaac Butler recounts it. Ever since Brando's ascension, there has been a private method comprising of Strasberg's teachings and a public one based on the lore of how American actors worked. After De Niro, these two forms of method diverged almost totally. As elaborate tales of preparation, research, and physical transformation became a major component of media and awards campaigns, the method became synonymous with a Baroque process by which an actor lives as a character, transforms their body, and refuses to stop acting once on set. What was already a confused label when it was being applied to Brando became even more confused when it became associated with De Niro's specific process. I think the new definition took over in the cultural lexicon because while Stanislavsky's actual teachings are too esoteric to quickly and easily be summarized in a news article, an actor staying in character for a role is very attention-grabbing, sounds exotic, and is pretty easy to comprehend. If a group of actors are going to start doing this thing where they stay in character and get up to a bunch of shenanigans on and off set, it makes sense to have a name for that, and the poorly defined method acting just happened to be laying around waiting to be used. It also just happens to make great clickbait and plays into the whole marketing aspect of Oscar campaigns. When Jared Leto was doing promotion for Suicide Squad, he was telling all these stories about the crazy stuff he did on set, and then after he started getting criticized for it, he later said that a lot of it wasn't true. Was he just changing his story to save face, or was he just making these stories up in the first place for the sake of promotion? And further, as many of Stanislavsky's ideas about acting went from being the novel new approach to just part of the accepted language for how acting is done, giving it a specific label became no longer necessary as time went on. The problem, though, is that now when somebody says method acting or the method, they could be referring to anything from something based in Stanislavsky's approach more broadly, to Strasberg's teaching specifically, to the very specific intensive approach that De Niro popularized. One question I still had at this point, though, was how responsible for the modern idea of going method is Stella Adler? If what De Niro was doing is not what Stanislavsky taught and wasn't the original method, then where did it come from? Adler placed more emphasis on the external aspects of the system. This could mean anything from the way a costume affected the character to what was communicated through how you handled a prop. She said, everything is based in actions. An actor develops a character from the things he does. That's why the actor must understand actions. With Adler's method, you didn't go into your past to try to bring up emotions to use in a performance. Instead, like Stanislavsky, she taught that if you imagined and committed to the details of the world, of the character, and the story as fully as you could, the appropriate emotion would flow from that. What's important for understanding this, though, is that for both Stanislavsky and Adler, the commitment to the circumstances was largely an imaginative one. They both worked and taught primarily in theater. Committing to the circumstances meant being able to imagine them so vividly that you would believe them. It didn't mean actually recreating them, since that would have been impossible on the stage, or trying to live as the character off of the stage. So when De Niro learned to drive a taxi for Taxi Driver, it's likely he was influenced by the stress that Adler placed on the importance of understanding the actions of the character and their profession. But again, what Adler's teaching here, at least what's recorded of her teachings in the book The Art of Acting, places more emphasis on the study of the profession through observation and imagination, and less on actually doing it yourself. However, while she never explicitly taught in her books staying in character or other extremes that we now see as going method, I can definitely see how the way she spoke about acting and the general attitude she had about the craft might have pushed De Niro towards his approach. She treated acting as if it were deathly serious business. Don't, for any reason except death, stay away from class. Don't get a cold, don't get a backache, and don't go to your psychoanalyst. It doesn't belong in theater. You must study the theater the way a priest or rabbi studies scripture. You cannot possibly use a sword unless you study with a specialist for at least 6 months. If we truly do these actions, we don't have to worry about acting. If we're actually doing something, we don't have to worry about faking. And I think when some of these ideas got transposed into acting for film, suddenly there was a lot more room to try to make the given circumstances an actual reality while performing on set and in between takes. Some actors and directors chose to see how far they could push this. De Niro and those who followed in his footsteps are just attempting to commit to the circumstances as literally as possible. It's a conceptually subtle shift in the goal, from imaginatively finding the truth of a performance internally to trying to make the given circumstances true externally. But what this shift looks like in practice turns out to be anything but subtle. It's this more literal commitment to the circumstances that we now label going method. De Niro's approach has some small foundation in Adler's teachings and therefore also in Stanislavsky's, but so do many, many other acting techniques used by actors today who don't go method. The fact that some actors have used going method as an excuse to create real circumstances that end up being uncomfortable, abusive, or even just frustrating for the film's cast and crew is something I think we can condemn while separating it from the value we can find in Stanislavsky's teachings and his influence on film acting as a whole. And when these actors that go method now deny being method actors, I think there's probably one of two things happening. On one hand, they might be trying to just dodge the bad reputation that method acting has gained, even though it's literally the kind of approach they're taking that gave it a bad reputation in the first place. Or some of them might be informed enough to know that what they're actually doing has basically no real relationship to Stanislavsky or Strasberg's teachings.
Stanislavsky was a shit actor. Didn't really know what the fuck he was talking about.
I want to mention here that I think there's definitely something to be said for trying to make the given circumstances real on set to some extent. I mean, it's not uncommon for actors to talk about how much easier it is to perform on a well-made set rather than in a green screen void. And it makes sense that the less pretending you have to do about your environment, the more energy of your imagination you have to direct towards making the character's emotional reality feel real. But I think there's an obvious line to draw here between what a good costume or walk or set or a bit of training can bring to a role and trying so hard to make the given circumstances a reality that you push the boundaries of what is safe and healthy emotionally and physically for yourself and the rest of the cast and crew. Even a lot of what Adler taught, when not taken to an extreme, I think can produce great results. For example, Riz Ahmed spending 7 months learning American Sign Language and how to play the drums for his role in Sound of Metal.
We just met up every day for 7.5 months, just speaking in ASL, just signing for several hours every day.
Absolutely brought a depth and realism to that performance that I think is beautiful and which helps to represent the community the story is about. I think this kind of work can be done while remaining respectful and sensitive to those you are working with. That kind of work just doesn't tend to make for an attention-grabbing headline. But anyway, my goal here is not to try to defend method acting or to rescue the term method in the cultural lexicon. After all the research and reading I've done, to me it seems like the term is far too hopelessly confused to rescue. If someone says method acting, it's almost impossible to know what they mean unless you clarify a bunch of things, and applying the term to anything based in Stanislavsky's teachings to me just doesn't make practical sense anymore. I think what's more useful at this point, rather than worrying about what people think of method or whether or not Brando or De Niro or anybody else really is a method actor or whether it deserves credit for influencing the history of film acting, would be to understand and talk about the specific influence of some of Stanislavsky's ideas and teachings and how they transformed not just the way actors worked, but the actual end goal that actors were trying to achieve on screen. So here finally, I want to shift from untangling this complicated mess that is the method and towards what I think actually changed acting forever. As I've been doing the research to understand how American film acting evolved, most of what I see talked about is the kind of stuff we've been talking about so far. The specific techniques, where they came from, who taught them, and how they impacted performances. But I think the techniques these teachers were teaching and actors were using are probably secondary to something else. Let's go back to that Brando performance in Streetcar and On the Waterfront. These performances were definitely influential, but there are multiple ways of thinking about their influence. One common narrative you hear is that Brando was using a new method which produced realistic results. He gave a great performance, and so it's the method that changed acting. But what if the specific approach that Brando used was less important than simply the fact that he and director Elia Kazan were aiming for a different outcome with the performance than most other actors in Hollywood were at the time? Perhaps what was most influential was the overall shift towards psychological realism and emotional truth as the goal of acting. And while there were others who had the same goal, like John Garfield, as we pointed out, Brando just happened to be the first to have serious critical acclaim. It's also worth noting that around this same time, there were some more naturalistic and realistic performances that weren't coming from the method and Stanislavsky school of acting. One example is this performance from Orson Welles in The Third Man.
Exactly who did you tell about me? I told the police. Unwise, Holly. And Anna? Unwise.
In the 60s and 70s, the naturalism and psychological realism that was brought to the screen by actors such as Jane Fonda, Dustin Hoffman, Warren Beatty, Harvey Keitel, Marilyn Monroe, Al Pacino, and many others started gaining more attention and critical acclaim. And many of the actors in this time were applying the approaches developed by Stanislavsky and passed on through Strasberg, Hagen, Adler, and Meisner. But as this was happening, the standard for what a good performance was began to shift away from the classical theatricality and towards realism and naturalism and perceived authenticity. This shift was supported by a general shift around the same time towards realism and naturalism in the rest of filmmaking as a whole. Adler described it like this in the 80s. Nowadays, we don't want artificiality, we want realism, and that's why if the audience thinks you're acting, you've failed them. From a contemporary perspective, it's easy to think, nowadays we don't want artificiality? Wasn't realistic performance always the goal the whole time? The answer is no, actually. Here's a story Uta Hagen tells in Respect for Acting about some of the feelings one actor had towards a realistic presentational performance. French actor Coquelin called his fellow actors together backstage and said, "I cried real tears on stage tonight. I apologize. It will never happen again." His approach to acting was obviously representational. For him, a genuine experience on stage was rejected in the belief that it would muddy or blur the acting. When film was born in the 1900s, realism wasn't the popular approach in theater, and in the silent era of film, performance was expected to be more expressionistic and theatrical. A lot more had to be conveyed through expression since dialogue and voice weren't available, and some of this carried over into the early talkies. Most of the time in film, the actors weren't performing the classics, but the styling that people expected to see in theater bled over into cinema. In the early 1900s, when Stanislavsky's trained Moscow Art Theater troupe put on performances in America, it was the hot new thing. It began inspiring a new wave of American theater acting, not just to teach his methods, but also to pursue realism as a goal in acting. By the mid-20th century, this goal was making its way into film. However, the influence towards realism was coming from many directions simultaneously. Around the same time, actors like Brando were bringing a new level of realism to performance in cinema. The influence of the French New Wave and Italian neorealism were also making its way into American cinema. In the 60s and 70s, the new Hollywood directors like Martin Scorsese, who was heavily influenced by international cinema, began increasingly to move away from the old studio filmmaking system and styling. How movies were lit, shot, and edited changed, and as all this happened, equipment was improving. Lighter cameras, smaller lighting equipment, newer film stocks, and better audio recording equipment all made shooting outside of the studio environment on real locations more feasible, which brought a new sense of realism to film. More realistic acting simply fit better within this new paradigm of filmmaking. And at the time, if you were an actor wanting to learn how to act within this new paradigm, most of the teachers were teaching some variation of Stanislavsky. Some of the teachers claimed that their approach was the single best way to achieve truth in a performance. But I think the reality is that there are a variety of ways to achieve more realistic results. While Strasberg, Adler, and Stanislavsky's teachings have had an important influence on the techniques that many actors still use today to achieve realism in performance, they certainly don't have a monopoly on how realism can be achieved. These days, naturalism and realism is so ingrained and expected that we can sometimes see it used even in performances of the classics on stage.
The inconstant moon? That monthly changes in her circled orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable.
What shall I swear by?
Do not swear at all.
To this day, there are many who would consider this the wrong way to perform Shakespeare. But art, whether it's on stage or in a film, is hard to pin down. It's constantly shifting as our expectations of what constitutes good changes. Some of my favorite performers these days, ones who produce performances with incredible range and depth, subscribe to no particular technique or approach. Here's Sandra Hüller, who gave 2 of the best performances of 2023, giving her advice for actors.
Just do it.
Paul Giamatti, who also gave one of the best performances of 2023, said,
I've unlearned a lot of things, so I don't know anything I realize about acting. Man, this is a mystery to me.
Robert Pattinson, who has given some great performances, once said in an interview, "My only technique is sprinting up to a cliff and just jumping off of it." I'm not trying to devalue any teaching, approach, technique, or training, but my research on this topic has made me hesitant to craft a narrative in this video that places too much credit for the evolution of acting on any one specific approach or person. Filmmaking is a collaborative medium, and no actor performs in a vacuum. Their performances are shaped by editing, direction, writers, other cast members, and even set design. What is clear to me is that Stanislavsky's ideas were indeed a seed that caused a seismic shift in our perception of acting. And it's certainly possible that the shift towards realism would have happened without him. But if we untopple the dominoes of acting history, many do lead back to the system. But even Stanislavsky refused to take credit for his system, saying, "It's customary to call what we have been studying the Stanislavsky system. That is a mistake. The strength of this method lies precisely in the fact that no one conceived it, no one invented it." From the small amount of acting I've done myself, from watching a lot of performances, from trying to understand how they were made, and now reading a bunch of different perspectives on the subject, my takeaway is really that acting is an art, not a science. Like music, you can create and teach music theory all you want, and learning music theory might in fact make you a better musician. But what matters at the end of the day is not what is technically right, but whether the music connects with the audience. Many of the best musical artists never formally learned music theory, even though they inevitably and intuitively employ aspects of music theory in their music. Acting, I think, is the same. Stanislavsky said, "The system is a reference book, not a philosophy. Work on the system at home, on stage put it aside. You cannot act the system. There is no system, there is nature." And while the realism of presentational acting for Stanislavsky was the true goal and art of acting, and I personally find naturalistic and realistic performances to be some of my favorite, producing the most evocative and deep performances I've ever seen on screen, that doesn't mean there isn't an art and a value to more theatrical representational acting as well. And even though there's been a seismic shift towards realism and naturalism being the bar by which we judge good acting, there are many great actors who still give very theatrical and stylized performances. You could possibly even make an argument that these types of performances are making a bit of a comeback recently. A lot of people profess an unironic love for Nicolas Cage's acting, who I've rarely seen give a totally naturalistic performance. I love Mia Goth's recent work in Pearl. Ryan Gosling's Ken is hilarious in Barbie and perfect for the role of a doll. Willem Dafoe really leaned into the theatricality of his role in The Lighthouse, and it was one of my favorite performances that year.
Let Neptune strike ye dead, Winslow!
And much of the acting in Wes Anderson's movies, one of my favorite directors, is deliberately anti-naturalistic. But many of these strike me as a unique blend between stylized theatricality and realism. There's a way in which some performances seem to find psychological truth in the most seemingly absurd places. For example, Emma Stone's now Oscar-winning performance as Bella Baxter in Poor Things might seem like it is anything but realism at face value. But is it? In interviews, I get the feeling that Stone was going beyond just trying to represent the emotions and developmental arc of Bella.
She was just full of joy and curiosity and a true love. That was an amazing lesson to take with me and to try to get to live in the shoes of every day. And so I really miss playing her. I miss Bella.
These are the kinds of things you would expect to hear from an actor who is trying to commit to the given circumstances and find the truth in the performance. And it seems like there was, on some level, an attempt to actually portray the experience of being a child's brain in an adult's body, even if the end result looks unlike anything we've seen in film. Acting, like any art, is an ever-evolving mess of ideas and practices. What resonates deeply with people in one time or place might feel stale and boring in another. The same techniques that have crafted some of the most uniquely rich and emotionally deep performances can be taken too far. Not every role requires the creation of the life of the human spirit, as Stanislavsky put it, but when some actors do manage, magically and artistically, to capture that, I think it can be beautiful. Two movies from 2023 that I think capture both ends of this spectrum of acting are Passages and Fallen Leaves. Passages delivers some incredibly naturalistic performance, and Fallen Leaves leans more into an anti-naturalistic, stylized form of acting. But I think if you watched both of these, you'd see how both of these approaches can convey what feels like real emotional content. Both of these movies in the US are available exclusively on Mubi, my sponsor for this video. Mubi is a hand-curated online streaming cinema with an incredible selection of movies from all around the world. You can find a great selection of art house, classics, independent, and international films. It's a great library to just explore and find some incredible movies that you can't find anywhere else, but also a tool you can use to expand your knowledge of cinema. Check it all out by going to mubi.com/ThomasFlight, where you can sign up for a 30-day extended free trial. That's right, you can give it all a try for free and explore the library for 30 days on me. Just go to mubi.com/ThomasFlight. I love Mubi. It's a great resource for anyone who's interested in film. So check it out at mubi.com/ThomasFlight. Thanks again to Mubi for sponsoring this video.